Hello, my name is Mrs. Khan. This is Utica Academy for International Studies, a visual arts interview with Colleen Curtis. She is option HLA. All right, Colleen, this is a beautiful portfolio here. Why don't you take the lead and talk about your pieces, your theme, and all that's encompassed in your portfolio.
All right. Well, the biggest part of my portfolio is obviously the theme itself, which is fashion and fashion design and all that encompasses it and what it also affects. Personally, fashion is a big part of my life because I want to become a fashion designer, and I really wanted to use this opportunity to explore it in all its different aspects. I believe that fashion is something that isn't necessarily what people typically identify it as just being clothing or the presentation of clothing itself, but I also wanted to understand how fashion has the ability and the potential to affect someone so deeply as to make them change themselves or picture themselves in a different way and different things like that. And this is what my portfolio is pretty much about. One of the first themes that I wanted to portray in my portfolio was the typical idea of what fashion is. So that goes into the 3 skirts that I created and the dress as well. Each of these pieces brings something different to the table in showing not only different techniques in sewing, but also in construction itself, design, and different techniques as well. So the first skirt is on the left is made out of Solo cups, which is an unconventional material, and I figured in this way I would be bringing an entirely new idea to what fashion could be. Fashion doesn't necessarily have limits, and I wanted to show that in creating something out of a material that no one would think to use in creating a skirt. And I'm very happy with the results. And I think that in doing this project, I discovered a very different way to approaching fashion and what it could mean to other people. Next, I interacted with screen printing and I created a skirt using that technique. I designed the screen print myself, of course, and then I used it on a skirt that I also made myself. This was a technique that I had used before, but I wanted to go further into it, and after creating this piece, I do feel a lot more experienced in this medium and look forward to using it again. Moving on, the next piece, the next skirt, was something that I wanted to delve deeper into construction itself. This is one of the main foundations in fashion because if you can't sew well, your pieces won't look good and they won't present themselves well to the audience. In this way, I experimented with pleating and used box pleats and strong material and construction skills to create a skirt that stands out on its own for having clean lines and strong construction. Lastly, I created the bell sleeve dress, and this was one of the pieces in my collection that also reflects on fashion ideas of the past and is somewhat retro inspired, which also goes into my pencil piece, Retrofuturism, which was inspired by Retrofuturism as the name suggests. However, the dress focuses on a different trend in fashion, which was more in the 60s and 70s, and I specifically achieved this through use of a colorful and very bright and contrasting print and the use of strong bell sleeves, which are made obvious in the presentation. I believe that this is one area of fashion that people don't always make notice of, which is where we draw inspiration from the past but yet modernize it and bring it into the future. And this was something that I thought was very important to incorporate into my portfolio because often when people think of vintage fashion, they just think it's something that's stuck in the past. And I wanted to allow the audience to reimagine and redefine what vintage fashion means and bringing it into modern times, but still keeping the ideas from the past involved.
It's interesting, very interesting.
The next theme, in a way, that I took from fashion was, as I mentioned before, its potential to affect people, specifically through eating disorders. I analyzed this in my piece Full first, and this is one of the pieces that is very different from anything else I created in my portfolio, as it is a multimedia piece, but I created it using a papier-mâché base and then watercolor and masking on the sides. The body itself is painted with acrylic and tempera, and I also used pen and ink to add to the shading, and then painted over that again. After seeing the result of this piece, I am very happy with this technique that I used, because I believe papier-mâché was something that I wanted to incorporate into my portfolio, because I think it's often neglected when looking into mediums to use for your art pieces. So I wanted to use it in a different way in creating a three-dimensional piece that would stand out and could be viewed from multiple dimensions to give it even more meaning. As I mentioned, this links to eating disorders, specifically anorexia, and that kind of goes into why the words full are surrounding the body, because I wanted to show the influence that fashion has to make someone feel not only insecure about themselves, but that they must physically alter themselves, and can also can make them mentally unstable and making them want to achieve the standards of beauty that fashion has set, specifically through the standards that models of runways or even celebrities today are seen beautiful. But again, the idea that a celebrity is beautiful stems from what I believe stems from what we see through fashion, and the idea that someone has to be slim and look very streamlined to be considered beautiful. I also analyzed anorexia, but it was a bit more subtle in the piece with the black hair and bright yellow skin, and this is called Self-Portrait. I think the title may be slightly misleading, as it isn't a self-portrait of me, but I wanted the title to give the audience a chance to reflect on themselves and the fact that even though they may not have an eating disorder, fashion still has the potential to affect them so deeply without even realizing it. Throughout the process of creating this piece, I again reverted back to the technique of using multimedia, and you created this piece using pen and ink, and I also involved acrylic and tempera for the bright colors. This piece, as I said, hints to eating disorders, but it links to the audience because, as I said, the title leaves it open. But the idea that an eating disorder is present, again specifically anorexia, is shown through the bone structure and the sharp and geometric shapes that the piece offers. And it's also enhanced by the dramatic shading that the pen and ink brings to the piece. Lastly, I analyzed anorexia in my photography piece titled Full. I took a picture of myself and used different kinds of filters and things of that nature to enhance it and completely omit my irises and pupils from the picture and instead leave the eye sockets looking hollow and blank. I also put a piece of paper over my mouth, again connecting to my first piece, Anna, and using the word full. This was another way of showing how anorexia or other eating disorders have the potential to affect someone, because it not only affects what they see in themselves, but what others see of them. So in looking at a internal conflict, it also creates an external conflict, because eating disorders are a growing problem in today's society, and I personally have noticed this, and I wanted to show what I think of when I look at someone who has an eating disorder. Because while they themselves may feel alright, when you're looking at them, they just don't look healthy, they look hollow, hence the empty eyes and the suggestion that they tell everyone that they're fine, which leads to the word full covering their mouth, because that's just what they keep telling themselves, but the truth isn't coming out, which is why the mouth is completely covered. Moving on to a piece that also shows fashion's effect on people and society, but not necessarily through eating disorders, are my two pieces on the right, Slipping Through the Cracks and Reflecting. First, talking about reflecting, this again somewhat connects back to my idea of using inspiration from the past that I involved in my two fashion pieces created from fabric. But instead, I wanted to show how a piece has the potential to have many interpretations. The first being right away that a girl looking in the mirror would see herself as fat because of society's standards set for herself, and she's never going to feel that she's fully attained the beauty that society expects her to have. However, when I originally created this piece, I utilized nude studies, and I also took advantage of nude portraits and paintings from the past, specifically in the periods of Neoclassicism and Baroque, and I utilized these to show that today's body standards of beauty and comparing these to the past, today's standards are almost unattainable, whereas in the past they were something that relatively any woman could achieve. The idea that beauty is something that is almost unattainable is something that I feel is wrong with society, and I wanted to show that without directly attacking or making a violent piece, but I wanted it to be something that the audience could consider themselves and find out on their own rather than just making it a bit more obvious. Another aspect of this portrait that I discovered after talking about it with fellow classmates was that it can also appear as if a woman, her reality portrayed by the reflection in the mirror, is so confident in her appearance that it doesn't matter what her size is, and she feels as beautiful as someone who is streamlined and thin and considered beautiful by today's standards, hence the real woman who is outside of the mirror's frame. I thought that this was an interesting interpretation that the piece could offer to the audience, though it was not the first one that they would draw. This again goes back to my experimentation with the idea that the audience could take away multiple messages and themes from a piece without it having so much detail and extravagance created in, that it would be confusing or suggest something that I didn't want it to.
Okay.
The next piece, as I mentioned, Slipping Through the Cracks, also portrays the societal pressures on people through fashion. The multiple faces that are drawn within the head and the upper chest are again representations of today's standards of beauty, specifically the face. Because earlier I believe that I explored in my pieces Reflecting, Anna, and Self-Portrait, I was more exploring the effects on the body that we have for beauty, but not necessarily the face. So in this piece, I showed the effect of makeup on an individual. Makeup is something that people often look to, not necessarily to enhance their beauty, which I believe is its true purpose, but to cover up and hide. And I wanted to show that this is something that also affects the fashion industry. Okay. And as I said, these are things that greatly affected my entire portfolio, but they were not the main themes. But again, I wanted to show how fashion isn't just the clothing that we wear, but how it affects us too. And I think that this was something that I believe I was successful in, as I portrayed many different aspects, as I mentioned in the specific pieces. And I believe my messages are clear to the audience. However, other interpretations that link to the message still come across, and I think in that way I was also successful, because it's not always necessarily about what I was intending the audience to take away, but the fact that they are taking away something and realizing that fashion isn't, as I said, just necessarily the clothing that we wear, but how it affects us internally and how it affects others and our interactions with others and the world around us.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Colleen.